She was left on the roadside with her unconscious son, cast out by a powerful family who painted her a villain. But what they didn't expect was her comeback. With nothing but courage, she found love, justice, and rebuilt a life from ashes. This isn't just a survival story. It's a rebirth you won't forget. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove light always finds those who refuse to give up. The Arizona sun was merciless that afternoon. No clouds, no breeze, just heat so thick it clung to your skin like wet cloth. I remember the way the asphalt shimmered like water, taunting me as I staggered toward the horizon with Liam's limp body in my arms. His little hand, once so full of life, hung uselessly at his side. 9 years old, and already he had seen more cruelty than I'd known in my first 3 decades. His breath came in shallow, whimpering puffs, his cheeks flushed and unnatural red. I don't remember how long we'd been walking. Time had stopped mattering when the gate slammed shut behind us, when Eleanor's voice snapped like a whip. "You don't belong here, and neither does your bastard son." The dirt clung to our skin. My dress was torn at the hem and stained with blood, his and mine. My feet were blistered and swollen, but I kept walking, because what else could I do? I had no phone. They'd taken that. I had no money. That too. Just a cracked bottle of water and a cloth bag with a change of Liam's clothes. The road stretched endlessly ahead, empty and punishing, no gas station in sight. The silence was broken only by the wind, which hissed across the dry plains like a curse, and by the occasional cicada scream, shrill and unrelenting. Each passing car sent up a storm of dust, but none slowed. Not even once. I waved. I shouted. But who listens to a woman on the side of the road with a bleeding child and nothing else? Liam stirred once, murmured something I couldn't make out. I stopped, dropped to my knees, and cradled him tighter against my chest. My voice cracked from the dryness in my throat. "Stay with me, baby. Please. Just hang on. I'll find help." But there was no help, only the wide desert, the scent of scorched gravel, and the sound of my own panic beating inside my ears. I glanced back at the Whitmore estate, now just a shadow on the horizon, its white stone walls and wrought iron gates gleaming like polished bones under the sun. I had once walked through those halls with pride, pregnant and naive, thinking love would protect me. But after my husband's death, they turned on me, said I pushed him, said I wanted his money, said Liam wasn't even his. Their lies spread like wildfire through that town, and not one soul stood up for me. Not even the staff I'd treated like family. In the end, they stripped me of my dignity, my home, and tried to take my son. And now we were dying on the roadside, invisible to the world. I don't know how long we lay there. Minutes? Hours? Time blurred, stretched by the heat and my fear. I couldn't cry. My body was too dry for tears. I whispered into Liam's ear, sang an old lullaby my mother used to hum, more for me than for him. I was about to close my eyes when I heard the low growl of an engine. A truck. The sound was distant at first, but then it grew closer, louder. I didn't look up. I'd been fooled too many times already. But the sound didn't pass, it slowed. Tires crunched gravel. A shadow fell over us. My heart jumped. I dared to raise my eyes. A silver Ford F-150, dusty and aged, had pulled onto the shoulder. The door creaked open and boots hit the ground. A man's figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, sun-leathered skin beneath a faded denim shirt. He didn't speak at first, just looked at us, his brow furrowed, expression unreadable beneath the brim of a weathered hat. Then he spoke, voice deep and low, the kind that made you listen even when it was soft. "The boy's got a fever." He crouched, not close, just near enough. "I've got water. I've got a truck. I know a doctor." I gripped Liam tighter, unsure whether to believe him. My instinct screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was out of choices. The man seemed to sense my fear. He stepped back. "I won't touch either of you," he said, "but he needs help. If you let me, I can take you both somewhere safe." Then, slowly, he unscrewed a bottle of water and placed it on the ground, backing away. "No pressure. It's yours if you want it." That moment broke something in me. No threats, no assumptions, no pity, just quiet respect. I reached for the bottle with shaking hands, unscrewed the cap, and dribbled water onto Liam's cracked lips. His throat moved slightly. He was still with me. I looked at the man again. He didn't rush, just waited. I nodded once. He opened the truck door and helped me in, still careful not to touch me. Inside smelled like dust and old leather, faint traces of antiseptic clinging to the dashboard. The engine rumbled as we pulled away from the empty road. I didn't ask his name. I didn't thank him. I couldn't speak. My arms were wrapped around my son, and my heart thudded in terrified relief. I kept waiting for the moment he'd ask something of me, my story, my intentions, who I was. But he didn't. He just drove. Miles passed. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden fingers across the fields. Finally, we turned off onto a dirt path that wound between patches of dry grass and tall oaks. At the end of the path stood a house, 3 stories, red brick, shutters slightly faded but intact. It stood tall, dignified, like it had known sorrow and survived. He parked the truck, turned off the engine. "Come inside. There's a guest room. You can rest there. I'll call someone to take a look at the boy." I carried Liam up the porch steps. My arms trembled, but I held on. He opened the door and stepped aside to let us through. The house smelled like pine and old paper. On a side table, a photo frame displayed a smiling woman and a young girl clutching a teddy bear. He noticed me looking. "My wife and daughter," he said, voice quiet. "They passed, long time ago." I nodded, said nothing. He pointed to a room down the hall. "There, I'll get you clean towels and water." I laid Liam down on the bed, removed his shoes, and brushed the hair from his damp forehead. His breathing was still ragged, but steadier now. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the tears slide down my cheeks. That night, I sat by the window, watching the sky turn deep blue, then black. Crickets chirped in the brush. The house was quiet but not cold, and in that stillness I whispered to myself, "You're safe for now. You got him through today." But something deeper stirred beneath that thought, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The morning came with the faint creak of old floorboards and the soft murmur of doves outside the window. I barely slept. My mind was still spinning, trying to stitch together the reality I had stumbled into. The bed beneath me was soft but unfamiliar. The sheets smelled faintly of cedar and sunshine, like they hadn't been used in a long time, but were lovingly kept. Liam lay curled beside me, his little chest rising and falling more steadily than it had the night before. The fever had broken sometime before dawn. I could still feel the panic in my muscles, as if it had burrowed beneath my skin. But at least he was alive. That's all I cared about. I stepped into the hallway quietly, barefoot, careful not to disturb the peace. The house was larger than I realized the night before, but empty in a way that felt more like grief than neglect. It was clean, kept, but not lived in, not really. On a hallway table, another photo of the woman and child I'd seen earlier stared out at me. The girl had thick curls and wore a dress with flowers. In her hands, she held a small brown teddy bear, the kind that looked loved beyond repair. I spotted it again later, resting on a worn armchair in the parlor. That bear hadn't been moved in years. He was in the kitchen when I found him, Colton. Shirt sleeves rolled up, a kettle whistling softly behind him on the stove. He turned at the sound of my footsteps but didn't speak right away. Instead, he nodded once and motioned to a chipped mug and a loaf of fresh bread on the counter. "Coffee's strong. There's eggs if you're hungry." His voice was even, maybe even kind, but restrained, like he wasn't sure how much space to give. I hesitated. Then with a nod, I poured a cup and sat at the table, hands wrapped around the warmth. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It felt necessary. We were strangers, but the kind who already understood something unspoken about each other. People who had both buried too much to fill the air with small talk. He finally broke the silence. "The boy's name?" "Liam," I said softly, watching steam rise from the cup. "He's 9. "He's strong," Colton said, folding a dish towel and setting it aside. "Held on longer than most would." I looked up at him then. His eyes weren't the color I expected. Not harsh or icy, but a soft gray blue that looked like they had once been vibrant and were now faded from sorrow. There were laugh lines on his face, but they hadn't been used in a long while. A man carved by fire and time. "Thank you," I murmured, "for stopping, for helping us." "You didn't have to," he shrugged. "Didn't do much." "You stopped," I said, meeting his gaze. "No one else did." He didn't respond, but I saw something shift in his expression. Just barely. He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter. "I lost my wife and daughter 6 years ago. House fire. They got out but didn't survive the burns." His voice was steady, like he'd rehearsed that line 100 times. After that, I didn't want people around much. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. He nodded once and looked out the window. The wind moved through the dry grass, making it ripple like ocean waves. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed. "I didn't even ask your name," he said. "Rachel," I said. "Rachel Monroe." "Well, Rachel Monroe," he said slowly, "you and your boy can stay as long as you need. I've got space. It's quiet out here. No one bothers me." My throat tightened. I wasn't used to kindness without strings. I can help around the house. I cook. I clean. I've worked hard. I almost said I used to have a home, but the words caught. "You don't owe me anything," Colton replied, not looking at me. "This isn't a trade." But still, that night, I cleaned the dishes after dinner. I swept the porch. I folded the towels he left in the dryer. Not because I owed him, but because it gave me something to do with the weight in my chest. Later, I sat beside Liam while he slept. His cheeks had returned to their normal shade, his breath even. I smoothed his hair back, the way I had since he was a baby. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. I could hear the faint sounds of Colton in another part of the house, the clink of a glass, the rustle of a drawer. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next disaster. The next morning, I woke to the sound of laughter. It took me a moment to realize it came from Liam. He was sitting up in bed, holding a small stuffed rabbit. Colton must have found and set beside him. His smile was weak but real, and it felt like the sun had finally broken through the storm that had followed us for so long. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Is this our new house?" I paused. I didn't want to promise him anything. We'd had so many false starts. But I tucked the blanket around him and kissed his forehead. "It's a safe place," I said, "and that's enough for now." Later that day, I found Colton out by the barn, checking on the horses. The ranch was sprawling, acres of golden land framed by old wooden fences. The wind was gentler out here. It didn't bite like it had by the roadside. It carried the scent of hay, dust, and distant rain. He was brushing down a brown mare when I approached. "She's beautiful," I said. "She's mean as hell," he replied, grinning slightly. "But she listens." "Like most of the women I've known," I joked. That got a real smile from him, small but unmistakable. And it changed his whole face. For a moment, I saw the man he must have been before the fire, before grief hollowed him out. "I was thinking," he said, "Liam might like to see the horses when he's up to it. He would love that." We stood there a moment longer, watching the mare flick her tail at the air. The silence returned, but this time it felt warm, like the kind you share with someone who doesn't need to fill the space to make you feel seen. When I went back inside, I stopped by the living room and glanced at the mantel. That same photo again, Colton's family. But something else caught my eye now. There was dust on the frame, but not as much as I would have expected. Someone had cleaned it recently, carefully, reverently. That night, as I tucked Liam into bed, he looked up at me with those wide eyes. "Mom," he whispered, "do you think Mr. Colton is nice?" "I do," I replied softly. "I think he's kind. He doesn't yell," Liam said. "Or say mean things like Grandpa did." I swallowed hard. "No, he doesn't." "He could be like a cowboy," he said, already drifting off. "A quiet one." I smiled and kissed his forehead. "The best kind." And as I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into gentle darkness, I realized something I hadn't let myself believe until then. We were no longer surviving. We were beginning to heal. The third morning on the ranch arrived quietly, with golden light spilling through the thin cotton curtains like liquid honey. The warmth was different than the heat of the highway. It didn't smother, it embraced. I stood in the kitchen barefoot, a coffee mug warming my fingers, and watched Liam run in slow, playful circles outside with a stick in his hand, chasing invisible dragons across the dry grass. His color had returned. His eyes were brighter, and for the first time in months, he was laughing like a boy who believed the world wasn't out to break him. Colton sat across from me, sipping black coffee in silence. He didn't fill the air with words. I found I liked that about him. I didn't need another man who tried to fix everything with noise. His presence was calm, solid, like an old oak that had weathered too many storms to bother with explaining its strength. "You slept?" he asked quietly, not looking up. I nodded. "More than I thought I would." He gave a slow, approving nod, then added, "He looks better." The kid, he's got grit. He gets it from his grandmother, I said with a smirk. Not from me. He raised an eyebrow. My mom was tough, I added. Hard-shelled but full of stories. She raised me on her own. I think if she were still around, she'd slap me for ending up like this, but then she'd slap the people who put me here too. A faint smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. She sounds like someone I would have liked. She didn't take crap from anyone, I said, chuckling softly. I'm trying to remember how to be like that. The wind brushed against the side of the house, making the windows creak ever so slightly. We sat there, sipping quietly, the way two people do when neither needs to fill the space to prove they're alive. That afternoon, I ventured further into the house, not out of curiosity, but because something had shifted inside me. Maybe it was Liam's laughter. Maybe it was Colton's quiet steadiness. Or maybe I was just tired of living like a guest in my own skin. The house had high ceilings and thick walls that held onto memories. You could feel them in the stillness. Not haunting, just lingering. The hallway was lined with photographs. Family holidays, dusty black and white portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and scattered among them, pictures of Colton with his daughter. Her name was Annie. I saw it written in crayon on a framed drawing she must have done at age 5. Annie and Daddy ride Daisy. Above, 2 stick figures and a horse with a lopsided grin. In the parlor, beside the hearth, was a worn leather armchair, and on it sat that same teddy bear from the photograph. Its stitching was frayed, its fur nearly rubbed off in places, but it had clearly been loved deeply. I don't know what made me do it, maybe a shared instinct only mothers understand, but I picked it up gently, brushed the dust from its head, and set it upright on the seat like someone might come looking for it. Later that evening, as Liam dozed on the couch with a book resting on his chest, Colton came in from the barn, his boots tracking dust and straw. He removed his hat, combed a hand through his hair, and paused when he saw the teddy bear repositioned. She used to take that thing everywhere, he said, voice low. Even to church. Wouldn't let go of it, not even when the pastor asked her to. I figured. Why, I replied softly. He glanced at Liam, then back at me. You didn't ask about them. I figured if you wanted to tell me, you would. Another pause, and then he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. It was winter. Power went out during a storm. We lit the fireplace like always. But something was wrong with the chimney, some blockage. I was out in the barn. I didn't hear the smoke alarm. His voice faltered, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. By the time I ran in, he continued, flames had taken the back of the house. Annie was coughing. My wife, Emily, had pulled her into the hallway. I got them out, but they'd already breathed too much in. Burns, smoke. Emily lasted 3 days in ICU. Annie didn't make it through the night. I stood still, unsure whether to move toward him or not. But he wasn't looking for comfort. He was just sharing, maybe for the first time in years. She said something to me, he murmured. Right before she passed, she said, if you love me, let someone take care of you. Don't disappear. But I did. I vanished. Not physically, just shut it all off. And then we showed up, I said. You showed up, he replied, with that boy and a look in your eyes that said you'd fight anyone who tried to take him. I've fought everyone, I said, my voice cracking. The whole town, his family, lawyers, reporters. I got tired. But you didn't stop. I couldn't. He's all I've got. He's lucky, he said. I don't feel lucky, I whispered. I feel broken. Like someone's been chiseling pieces off me, and now I'm just trying to keep from falling apart. Colton didn't say anything right away. Then he reached out, not a grand gesture, just rested his hand on the back of the chair where the teddy bear sat. My daughter's room hasn't been touched, he said, not because I was preserving it, because I didn't know what to do with it. It's just frozen, I nodded. But maybe, he added, some things don't have to stay frozen. Maybe some things thaw when the time is right. That night, I sat outside with Liam under the stars, wrapped in a quilt that smelled of sage and pine. He leaned his head against my shoulder and asked, Is Mr. Colton sad? I thought for a moment. He was. He still is. But he's starting to remember how to feel something else too. Do you trust him? That question hit harder than I expected. I'd spent so long expecting betrayal, learning to smell danger before it arrived. But Colton had never asked anything of me. Never pushed. Just gave space. And that, in its own quiet way, was trust. I think I do, I said honestly. And that scares me. Liam nodded solemnly, as if he understood too much for a boy his age. He's quiet, like the horses, but he sees everything. I kissed the top of his head. He does. Inside the house, a lamp glowed in the window. Colton moved past it, his silhouette framed in soft amber light. He wasn't a rescuer. I hadn't needed one. But he had given me something even rarer, room to breathe. And after all the silence, the judgment, the shame, that was the beginning of something I had almost forgotten how to hope for. A new chapter. One not defined by the fire behind me, but the light I was slowly walking toward. It started with the glances, the small-town kind, the kind that follow you not with curiosity, but judgment, sharpened like knives, honed over gossip. At first, I imagined it. The way the cashier's smile tightened when I walked into the general store. The way two women at the bakery leaned closer, whispering behind their hands when Liam tugged at my arm, asking if we could buy muffins. But the real blow came when I reached for the bread, and the clerk, who'd been all sweetness the week before, deliberately turned her back. "Store's closed for you," she said flatly. I blinked. "Excuse me?" She didn't even look up. "You heard me." I stood frozen, Liam beside me holding a jar of jam he had picked out with care. "Is there a problem?" She finally turned, her gaze cold and triumphant. "You think just because you moved in with Colton Hayes, people won't remember what kind of woman you are?" And that was it. No explanation. No chance to defend myself. Just an entire town that had decided my story for me and written me as the villain. We left without the bread. Liam was quiet on the way back. Too quiet for a boy who usually filled car rides with questions or made up songs. He stared out the window, small hands curled in his lap. When we reached the gate, a new sign had been posted, crudely hammered onto the fence, the words scrawled in black paint. "Protect decent men from scheming women." I didn't say a word. I pulled the car up the drive, parked, and told Liam to go inside and start his homework. I needed a minute to breathe. No, not breathe. Just keep from screaming. That night at dinner, he poked at his food, eyes down. "Did you do something wrong, Mom?" "No," I said too quickly. He pushed a green bean across the plate. "Then why won't people say hi to you anymore?" I couldn't answer. Not without unraveling. So I reached over, touched his hand. Some people believe things that aren't true, and some people don't like when others try to change their minds. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed. "But Mr. Colton believes you." "Yes," I said, my voice softer. "He does." That night, I stood in the hallway outside Colton's office, hearing the hum of the old radio, the creak of his chair. I didn't knock. I didn't need comfort. What I needed was strength, the kind I used to think I'd lost. The next Saturday, I took Liam into town again. School supplies, a new pair of sneakers. I told myself we'd hold our heads high, walk in like we belonged, because we did. But the whispers started before we even reached the store. Outside the hardware shop, I saw a familiar figure step out in a striking red dress, sunglasses perched on her nose like a crown. Eleanor Granger, of course. She moved like she owned the pavement, every click of her heels an accusation. She stepped in front of me at the door of the general store and smiled with all the poison of a wasp. "This town's small, Rachel," she said, voice cool and measured. "Rumors spread faster than prairie fires." I didn't flinch. "That's so?" She leaned closer. "You've been using your looks, your sob story. People are catching on." I met her eyes. "I've never forgotten who I am. Seems like you're the one worried about being forgotten." Her smile faltered, just slightly. "You're still a dependent," she hissed. "Still a failure, a widow's pity project." I stared at her, calm despite the blood rising in my throat. "If you believed your own lies, Eleanor, you wouldn't need to say them in public." A few people had gathered, curious ears, watching, listening, and not a single one of them dared to interrupt. Eleanor stepped back, sunglasses hiding what I suspected was fear, but she turned and walked away without another word. Liam looked up at me, wide-eyed. "Are you okay, Mom?" I crouched beside him, brushing a curl from his cheek. "I'm okay because I know I haven't done anything wrong." And for the first time I really meant it. Still, the gossip lingered like smoke in old curtains. The ranch became our haven. Colton never brought it up, but I could see it in his eyes. The anger, the helplessness. Once he told me, "I've lived with ghosts in this house for years, but at least they were silent. The living, they haunt with louder things." We weren't completely alone, though. Mildred McLean, the sheriff's wife, knocked on the door one bright morning. She carried a basket, warm bread, jars of jam, and apples that still smelled of dew. She walked in like a woman who didn't ask permission, only offered presents. "I heard we've got new folks around," she said. "Not here to pry. Just thought no one should start over feeling like a burden." I nearly cried. She sat in our kitchen, poured tea into mismatched mugs, and looked at me the way people rarely do, with honesty and no agenda. "I've known Colton since he had a full head of hair," she said with a chuckle. "I knew Emily too, and their little girl, helped with the funeral arrangements." She looked at me then, and I saw it, the understanding of loss, the recognition of a woman who had buried more than people would ever know. "Since they passed," she said, "Colton hasn't let anyone into that house. You're the first." I swallowed. "I'm not special, I'm just trying to survive." She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. It's usually the ones who think they're not special who make the biggest difference. When she left, she hugged both Liam and me. No speeches, no judgment, just warmth. It was a small crack of light in a wall built from years of distrust. Days turned into weeks. And though the town's judgment hadn't gone away, something in me had changed. I stopped apologizing with my posture. I started looking people in the eye again. I baked bread, I swept the porch, I helped Colton oil the hinges on the barn door, and when Liam ran through the fields pretending he was a cowboy, I laughed. Loudly. And every time someone in town whispered, turned away, or stared, I reminded myself we were still here, still standing. And sometimes that was the boldest act of defiance a woman could make. We didn't need their permission. We never had. It started with a man named Noah Green. He arrived in town during the middle of a dry spell, when the ground cracked under your boots and the sun didn't set so much as collapse behind the hills in a heap of gold. I didn't notice him at first. He blended into the landscape in his worn jeans, sun-faded shirt, and tousled brown hair. But Colton saw him, sitting outside the old cafe, scribbling in a leather-bound notebook, sipping lukewarm coffee like he had nowhere else to be. "He's a journalist," Colton said one evening, wiping his hands on a rag after fixing the fence line. "Out of Chicago, asks too many questions for someone just passing through." I felt a tug in my chest, part curiosity, part dread. "What's he asking about?" "You," Colton said without looking up, "and Charles, and Eleanor." My blood turned to ice. "Great," I muttered. "One more person here to spin a new lie." Colton placed the rag on the workbench. "He doesn't seem like the others, doesn't talk much, doesn't speculate, just listens." And that's exactly what he did. Noah approached me one cloudy afternoon outside the school supply store as I adjusted Liam's backpack and scanned the street for judging eyes. His voice was low, calm. "I've heard a lot of stories," he said, holding up his hands in peace. "But I don't write gossip, I write truth. Would you talk to me?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to keep moving. But something in his eyes stopped me, an honesty I hadn't seen since Colton. "Why?" I asked. "Because the louder voices usually belong to the people with something to hide," he said. "And I think they've been talking too long." So I agreed. We met at the end of town in a quiet, nearly forgotten cafe that still smelled of burnt toast and yesterday's coffee. Noah ordered nothing. He just opened his notebook and slid it between us. "I'm not recording," he said. "I'll only write what you let me." I stared at the pages for a long moment before speaking. And then I told him everything. About the night Charles died, about the phone call, the screaming, the sudden crash, about the way Eleanor twisted the story within hours, blaming me, coldly and with precision. I told him how Percy Langston, Charles's lifelong friend and financial advisor, had stepped in like a puppeteer, controlling what got released to the media and what didn't. I told him about the fake grief, the sympathy card interviews, and the inheritance that never made it into my hands. Noah didn't interrupt. He scribbled, nodded, underlined something occasionally, but mostly he just listened. Then I told him what no one else had heard, not even Colton. About the Bluetooth device in the car that had mysteriously vanished. About the dash cam I never got to see. About the night Eleanor made me choose between Liam or dignity, when they dragged me out of that house and left me on the roadside like I was nothing. By the end, I couldn't look at him. My hands were trembling. My throat was raw. But when I finally glanced up, There were no furrowed brows, no doubtful eyes, just quiet, steady respect. "I'll help you tell it right," he said. And he did more than that. Noah went digging where others wouldn't. He visited the old legal office that managed Charles's investments. He spoke to a retired accountant who remembered documents being rushed through without standard reviews. He found land transfers signed under Charles's name, but with a power of attorney he'd supposedly granted to Percy weeks after his death. Then he came back with a folder. It was thick, worn at the edges. Inside were copies of those forged contracts, statements from the accountant, a list of offshore accounts Percy had hidden under shell corporations. But the most damning piece? A security log showing the exact time a technician from Eleanor's estate entered the wreckage site the night after the crash. The same night, the Bluetooth system was mysteriously lost. Noah handed the folder to me over a pot of tea on Colton's back porch. "You can take this to the sheriff or the press or burn it, but if you want the truth out, you have what you need." I stared down at the papers like they were on fire. "They'll come after me harder." "Maybe," he said. "But this time, you won't be alone." He wasn't wrong. Later that week, I walked into the sheriff's office. Not hiding, not crying, just me, a manila folder in my hands and a spine that didn't shake anymore. Sheriff Martin looked up, startled, then gestured for me to sit. "I have something you need to see," I said, sliding the folder across the desk. He flipped it open, eyes narrowing as he read. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then he leaned back, lips pressed into a line. "I thought I knew Eleanor," he murmured. "Thought I knew Charles too. Turns out, we never really know people until they've lost everything," I said. That night, I told Colton everything. Every detail, every fear. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer hollow encouragement. He just sat beside me on the porch and held my hand in silence. A few days later, I started gathering more. Medical records from Liam's injuries the day we were thrown out. Testimonies from a former housekeeper I found through a domestic abuse support group. Voicemails Charles left during his worst nights, drunk, slurring threats. One afternoon, Colton found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by paper, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He sat beside me and slid a cup of tea into my hands. "You don't have to fight this alone," he said. I shook my head. "This isn't just for me. It's for Liam. He deserves a mother whose story wasn't rewritten by the people who tried to erase her." He smiled softly. "Then let's write the right one." The next morning I stood in front of the mirror. Same face, same scars, but different eyes. I was no longer the woman who'd collapsed on the side of the road. I was someone reclaiming her name. Noah published the first article a week later. Beneath the dust, the silenced truth of Rachel Monroe. The town didn't know what to do with it. For days, shop doors opened more slowly. The whispers paused when I walked by. Some people didn't meet my gaze. Others did, and nodded. And when I walked through town with Liam holding his hand, I didn't look down. I looked forward. The courthouse smelled like old paper, varnished wood, and something less tangible. Fear, maybe. Or memory. I sat in the back of the courtroom with Liam's hand in mine, heart thudding so loud I was sure the judge could hear it. The courtroom had never been a place of fairness to me. It was the stage where people with power rewrote the truth, polished their lies until they gleamed. But this time, I wasn't alone. This time, I had the truth, and I had people who believed in it. Across the aisle sat Eleanor Granger in a tailored gray suit, her lips a thin, bloodless line. Her pearl earrings caught the morning light as if to remind the room who she was. Money, reputation, entitlement. Beside her sat Percy Langston, smug and self-satisfied, leaning on a silver cane like it made him noble. I'd once been terrified of their kind. Today I wasn't. When the proceedings began, the plaintiff's attorney wasted no time. His words were like razors wrapped in velvet. "Your Honor, we're here because Miss Rachel Monroe is an unfit mother. She has no stable income, no permanent residence, and she cohabits with a man to whom she is not legally bound. Is this the kind of environment we deem acceptable for a child?" The room murmured. I sat still, spine straight. I'd been called worse in smaller rooms. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand slowly, my heels echoing on the polished floor, my heartbeat matching each step. I didn't cry. I didn't fidget. I looked the judge in the eye and told him the truth. Not the version scrubbed clean for sympathy, but the raw, painful kind. I've spent the last year trying to protect my son from people who see him as property, not a person. I've been lied about, thrown out of my home, and slandered by the very people who were supposed to be family. But through it all, I never abandoned Liam. I held him when he was sick. I taught him how to spell with borrowed books. I made soup from dried lentils and told him stories at night so he wouldn't fall asleep afraid. I laid out my evidence, Liam's medical records, letters from teachers, journals documenting our daily life. I didn't speak loudly. I didn't need to. The weight of it all did the work. If being a mother means never letting go, then I've done that every day of his life. Then came Finn. Noah Green stood with a confidence only the truth can give. He opened his notes but barely looked at them. I came to this town to chase a whisper, he said. What I found was a woman buried beneath years of lies. He presented his investigation like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. He showed the court Charles's phone logs the day of the crash. His last call was not to Rachel, but to a woman identified as his mistress. He played audio from voicemails where Charles screamed drunken accusations, never once mentioning his wife. He showed land contracts that had been manipulated, Colton Hayes' land stolen with signatures forged posthumously under Percy Langston's hand. Then he played the recording. It was Eleanor's voice. Once she loses custody, we'll reclaim everything. It'll be like she never existed. The silence in the courtroom was total. Percy shifted in his seat. Eleanor's eyes darted like a cornered animal. Colton stood next. He didn't wear a suit. He wore what he always did, denim, boots, a button-down shirt that smelled like sun and dust. But when he stepped to the witness stand, the room leaned in. I'm not here because I love Rachel, he said. Though I do. I'm here because that boy called me dad one day, and I didn't correct him. Because I didn't want to. Because I've watched her give more of herself to that child than anyone I've ever known. Because what she's given to Liam isn't comfort. It's survival. He paused. I run a 2,400-acre ranch. I've got no debt. I've got assets most men would brag about. But none of that makes me fit to be in that boy's life. What makes me fit is that I chose to stay when they had nothing to offer me, and I'll keep choosing them, every damn day. The judge didn't ask him a single question. Next was Mildred McLean. She didn't bring documents. She brought her heart. I've lived in this town 42 years, she said. And I've seen the way we treat women like Rachel. We call them trouble before we even ask their name. But I've been to her house. I've watched her with that boy. If she's not a mother, then we've forgotten what a mother is. I gripped the edges of my seat. The judge left for deliberation. 20 minutes passed, then 30. When he returned, the room tensed like breath held too long. He didn't read a long statement. He simply said, "This court rules that Rachel Monroe shall retain sole legal custody of Liam Monroe. Mr. Colton Hayes is hereby recognized as the legal stepfather. The petition to remove custody is dismissed. Additionally, criminal proceedings against Mr. Langston are now recommended to federal court." Gasps, then silence. Eleanor turned ghostly white. Percy's face twitched. Then, clink. Handcuffs. 2 federal agents flanked Percy before he could blink. He didn't struggle, he just slumped. As they let him out, Eleanor stood but couldn't follow. No one looked at her. Not even the ones who once whispered her praise. Her power had evaporated like smoke. I don't remember standing. I just remember my knees giving out. I didn't fall, not completely, because Colton caught me. One strong arm around my waist, the other bracing my back like I was something precious. I let myself lean into him, not out of weakness but relief. I did it, I whispered. I didn't give up. He nodded. You never do. Liam raced from the back row, arms wide. I crouched as he flew into me, and we stayed like that. Mother, son, and the man who had become our home. I had walked into that courthouse afraid I'd lose my child. I walked out having reclaimed not just him, but myself. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, and for the first time in years it felt like something was being washed clean. The rain had stopped by the time we got home. The ranch looked different that afternoon, not because anything had changed, but because everything had. The same dirt road curved gently through the trees, the same horses grazed lazily in the pasture, and the old red barn still leaned slightly to the left like a man who'd taken a few hits but kept standing. But this time, as I stepped out of the truck, Liam asleep against my shoulder, and Colton carrying our things. It wasn't a place we were staying. It was our home. Inside, the smell of warm bread greeted us. Mildred had let herself in and left dinner warming in the oven, along with a note in her looping cursive. Real homes don't need front-page stories. They need laughter and light. Welcome back. Colton and I exchanged a glance. No words, just a soft exhale between us. He reached over, took Liam from my arms, and carried him to the sofa. I watched them, my son curled against a man who had never asked to be a father but became one anyway. That night, after the dishes were done and Liam was tucked in, I stood barefoot on the porch. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke. The stars shimmered above like they finally had permission to shine for us. Colton joined me with 2 glasses of wine, his quiet ritual on rare evenings like this. He handed me one and wrapped a light sweater over my shoulders. "It's not for celebration," he said. "It's to remember we're still alive." I took a sip and looked at him. There was no armor left in his eyes, no walls, just a man who had let himself hope again. "I used to think love was a luxury," I said quietly, "like silk dresses in store windows, something beautiful but untouchable." He didn't respond right away, just sipped and stared at the sky. "But now I know," I continued, "real love isn't about being saved. It's about someone who sits with you in silence when you have nothing left and still chooses to stay." He turned to me then. His expression held no grandeur, just truth. "I have everything," he said. "Land, equipment, investments, more than I'll ever need. But for 6 years, I've lived in a 4,000-square-foot house where no one asked if I'd eaten, no one laughed in the hallways, no one turned on the porch light before dinner." I didn't look away. "And since you arrived," he continued, "this house finally feels like it has a heartbeat again." I set my glass down, afraid I'd spill it from the shaking in my hands. Not from nerves, but from the depth of what I felt. "I'm scared," I whispered, "because love is where people get hurt the worst." "I know," he said gently, "but that's also where we heal." He didn't kiss me, he didn't rush, he just reached out, hand open, steady, a quiet promise, not a demand. And for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't pull away. I placed my hand in his, and a kind of peace washed over me, one not built on fantasy, but earned through fire. We sat together in the old leather chair by the fireplace, the logs crackling softly. Liam slept upstairs. The house around us was quiet but not empty. "I used to think you saved me," I murmured. He shook his head slowly. "No, you reminded me it was still possible to live." We stayed like that until the flames dimmed and the room cooled with the night. No music, no grand declarations, just the soft breathing of 2 people who had once lost everything and now had each other. Weeks passed. The rhythm of our life didn't change all at once. There were still mornings when I woke up in a cold sweat, half dreaming of courtroom floors and Eleanor's icy stare. There were still afternoons when I'd hear Liam cry out from a nightmare, and I'd run to his room, only to find him holding that old teddy bear Colton had once dusted off and left quietly on the bed. But those moments grew fewer, and in their place came new rituals. Colton would come in from the barn with his hands still calloused and dirt under his nails, and I'd have coffee waiting. Liam would race barefoot through the house, trailing drawings behind him, horses, cowboys, and stick figures he labeled me, Mom, and Dad. One golden afternoon, Colton and I took him out to the barn, where an old small saddle hung on the wall. "Annie's," Colton said, his voice thick but steady. "She used to ride Daisy. Every time she got on that pony, she'd shout, 'I'm gonna be a cowboy like Daddy.'" Liam reached up, touching the faded leather. "Can I ride her too?" Colton smiled, real, soft, aching. "She'd be happy you did." Later that night, I found a child-sized cowboy hat hanging on a hook by the back door. It was worn and dusty, but placed there with care. "I haven't touched it in years," he said quietly behind me, "but it feels right now." The days began to take shape. I found myself cooking more, humming without noticing, folding laundry that smelled like sunshine. I caught Colton sitting on the porch, reading, not business reports, but the books I'd kept from Liam's school days. Ruby May, the teenager who lived down the road, started coming by to help with the garden. She'd once watched me from afar like I was something suspicious. Now she sat beside me in the dirt, asking questions about baking and heartbreak. Mildred stopped in weekly, bringing jars of pickles, jam, and stories of her younger days, which Liam devoured with wide eyes. She never came to preach, just to be present, to remind me that not all people in this town had forgotten how to be decent. One afternoon, while we were having lunch in the kitchen, Colton pouring water, me slicing bread, and Liam coloring quietly at the table, my son looked up and asked, "Mr. Colton, could you be my dad?" The room froze. My hand paused mid-slice. My breath caught. Colton looked down at his glass. "Liam," I started, but my son went on. "I just want Mom to have someone who makes her laugh. And you don't yell. You don't make her cry like Grandpa Charles did. You make her smile. That's what dads do." Colton stood, walked over, and knelt beside him. "There's better light by the window," he said gently. "Why don't we color over there? And later, Dad will help you draw a horse." Liam beamed. His eyes lit up with something rare and whole and joyful. "Dad," he whispered. "Now I have a dad." I turned away to hide the tears, but I felt Colton's hand on my shoulder as he stood. "He didn't mean," I began, but Colton shook his head. "I'm glad he sees that in me," he said. "And if it's all right with you, I'd like to keep earning it." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because in that kitchen, once silent, now full of life, I finally understood that love wasn't about declarations. It was about showing up, every day, without fanfare, without promises, just presence. And that, I realized, was more than I ever dared to dream. 2 years passed, and the ranch didn't just grow crops anymore. It grew people. It grew us. The red brick house that once echoed with loss now pulsed with life. Each morning, Liam's feet thundered down the hallway like a herd of wild horses, followed by the soft gurgle of our baby daughter, Grace. Her name hadn't been chosen lightly. Grace was Colton's promise to his late wife, and mine to the life we fought tooth and nail to reclaim. She had Emily's ash-gray eyes, my brows, and a mouth that seemed set in a permanent little smirk, like she already knew too much for someone who still needed help sitting upright. Colton doted on her in quiet ways, warming bottles without being asked, walking her around the garden in the early evening when she fussed, whispering to her like she understood the weight of his past. Sometimes I'd catch him staring down at her in wonder, like he couldn't believe he'd been given another chance. I didn't say anything in those moments. I just watched, letting the stillness carry us. Liam, now 10, had blossomed into a boy who laughed often, worked hard, and wrote even harder. He'd inherited Colton's quiet strength and my need to make sense of the world through stories. Every few weeks, he'd hand me a stack of pages, his latest short story, complete with hand-drawn covers and titles like The Man Who Planted Grass But Grew a Family or The Cowboy Who Saved a Star. His favorite place to write was in the old sunroom, where Colton had built him a simple desk from reclaimed wood. That room used to be where Emily read with Annie. Now it faced the garden where Grace crawled through wildflowers and Liam played tag with Ruby May, who'd become like an older sister to them both. Ruby had been accepted into Texas State's agricultural program, her dream. The day she got the letter, she ran straight to me, sobbing into my apron. "I did it," she kept repeating, "because you believed I could." I held her tight and whispered, "You did it because you finally believed it too." The community around us slowly began to shift, not because people changed overnight, but because they watched us and realized love and truth had roots deeper than gossip ever could. The sign that once hung on our gate, the one warning townsfolk to protect decent men from scheming women, was long gone. In its place, I hung a simple wooden plaque, hand-painted by Liam, Sunrise Ranch. Mildred came every Sunday with fresh bread and even fresher stories. She brought laughter and news of the outside world and always left a jar of pickles on the porch, even if we hadn't seen her that week. She became family without needing the title. But the most meaningful transformation wasn't external, it was the school. We turned the old tool shed behind the barn into a small classroom. It started with just a few kids, children whose parents worked in the fields or who'd been homeschooled without much structure or who simply didn't fit into the rigid public school system. Kids like Liam used to be too quiet, too sensitive, too much. I taught reading and writing, Colton taught practical math through barn work and planting schedules, and Ruby helped with science and nature studies when she had time. We didn't do it for money. We did it because we'd been those people. Unseen, unheard, forgotten. And someone once saw us helped us breathe again. It was our turn. Every afternoon, I sat at my desk and wrote in the classroom journal, not grades or lesson plans, but memories. Notes, gratitudes. Things like, today Jaden spelled his name without help for the first time and asked if that made him smart. I told him yes, and he smiled like he believed me. Liam read his story aloud today. The whole class listened, and no one laughed, they clapped. The house, once a quiet tomb of what was, now breathed with the kind of joy that didn't need to be loud to be heard. One crisp fall morning, I hung the final wooden sign on the front gate, Whitmore Community School. The irony didn't escape me. I kept the name, not for them, but for me. I wanted the world to see what the Whitmore name had become in my hands, not theirs. As I stepped back to admire it, Colton joined me, Grace in one arm and a thermos of coffee in the other. "She'll be proud of you," he said, nodding at the sign. "She?" I asked. He looked down at Grace, then over at the small cemetery that rested on the hill behind the ranch, the final place where Emily and Annie lay. "You gave her name a second life," he said quietly. "Not through stone, but through the kind of home she'd have wanted this place to be." A few days later, we returned to the graves as a family. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of pine and wild lavender. We knelt before the stones. Colton placed a fresh bouquet, and Liam set down one of his hand-bound stories, carefully wrapped in twine. "I told them about you in here," he whispered to the wind. "I told them how you helped Dad find us." Colton didn't cry. He just rested his hand on the stone and said softly, "You don't have to worry anymore. They're safe." Later that evening, under a sunset sky brushed with orange and lilac, we gathered in the garden for something I'd never thought I'd have again. A wedding. It wasn't grand. No expensive flowers, no hired musicians, just close friends, some neighbors who had come to understand us, and a handful of students who insisted on helping set the tables and string up the lights. Ruby picked wildflowers. Mildred baked the cake. Liam wore a small hand-stitched suit and acted as ring-bearer and unofficial master of ceremonies. Grace, cradled in her father's arms, cooed at the wind like she was in on the secret of the day. I walked toward Colton with bare feet and a dress I'd sewn myself. Nothing flashy, but made with every stitch anchored in love. We said our vows beneath the oak tree, where Liam first asked Colton to be his dad. Reverend Burns, the town's elderly pastor, placed his hands gently on our heads and said, "You are not beginning today, you are continuing." Love did not arrive with the ceremony. It was already living in the quiet moments. Today, we just honor it. Afterward, as the guests danced on the grass and the stars blinked into view, I sat with Colton on the porch steps, Grace between us, Liam curled up with his storybooks nearby. "You know," I said, "we never got our honeymoon." Colton smiled. "We've been living it." I rested my head on his shoulder, and he pressed a kiss to my hair. I used to believe that happy endings were for other people, for the ones who hadn't fallen, who hadn't been betrayed, who hadn't crawled through the dirt with everything they had left clutched to their chest. But now I know. Happy endings aren't about the absence of pain. They're about the return of hope. And that night, surrounded by laughter and the warm glow of string lights, I realized something simple and sacred. I wasn't just alive, I was whole. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means you've felt something, maybe even seen a part of yourself in Rachel, in Colton, or in Liam. This wasn't just a story about justice or love. It was about resilience, about what it means to fall hard, to be left behind, and still choose to rise, not bitter, but braver. Life doesn't always hand us fairness. Sometimes it hands us silence, shame, and shadows. But the truth? You don't have to stay where it left you. You have the power to rewrite your ending, to find your voice, and to create the family, chosen or otherwise, that gives you strength. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city, your country, or simply how it made you feel. And please, don't forget to subscribe. Every week, we bring you more stories that remind us all. Even in our darkest moments, there's always light waiting to be found. You don't have to walk alone. Until next time, take care and keep believing in new beginnings.